Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susanna Repo. I'm Program Manager here at the ELIXIR Hub. I'm very happy to welcome today Catherine Gaeta to give us a webinar about the first draft of ELIXIR Equal Opportunities Strategy. Catherine works at the EMBL EBI. She's a Gender Project Officer there, and she works in a cross-campus Sex in Science program here in Hingston, and she also coordinates the EMBL working group to raise awareness about issues facing women in science. And the aim is at EBI to establish a gender action plan based on the discussions at the working group. And Catherine is also involved with the iReform laboratories, and there is a specific inclusion working group there where she is working. I think this all sounds like Catherine has a lot of experience and expertise in this area, so we're very happy that Catherine has been working with us to draft the Equal Opportunity Strategy for ELIXIR, and we very much look forward to your webinar, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have a few slides. They should be available for you in the WebEx window there. So what I will do is to go through those, and if there are any questions that you have as we're going through, and there are some questions that I have to ask you guys as well, I would encourage you to save that to the end, and then we will talk about it then, and also any other points that occur to you as we're going through. So many thanks for the introduction. As I say, I am based at EMBL EBI, and I'm very pleased to be working with ELIXIR on their Equal Opportunities Strategy at the moment. So what I will cover in the webinar is the purpose and background for the Equal Opportunities Strategy, so why we need a strategy, why we have a strategy, then talk a little bit about institutional equal opportunities policies, look at areas such as recruitment, terms and conditions, also talk a bit about the committees and governance of ELIXIR itself, training and events, communities and collaborations, and then a key area which is of course data reporting, monitoring, and how we track outcomes from that, some ideas from an equal opportunities toolkit, and then just a word about how we will then move towards an equal opportunities policy, moving on from having a strategy. And then at the end, in summary, I have a set of the draft recommendations that we have at the moment, and these of course are open to consultation and discussion with you guys. And as I say, questions at the end. So moving through, so the document that you see the link for there on the slide is about providing some information, some recommendations on equal opportunities for ELIXIR. We have some recommendations on data gathering and the sequence for doing that. But the reasons why we feel we need to do this, why it's very important, is partly coming from a legal standpoint, that there are actually equal rights that are protected under national law. So there are a number of protected characteristics, and it does vary a bit from country to country, but it comes from a central driver, say from the UN. And these are areas such as age, disability, gender, sexual orientation, pregnancy, maternity. So these are areas that in various countries you need to protect the equal rights by law. It's also mentioned as part of the European Charter of Access to Research Infrastructures for Equality of Access, and of course it's part of the ELIXIR policy as well. There's also a very strong business case for diversity as well, because diversity does lead to better outcomes in research and business, and there is research to back this up from the Harvard Business Review and from McKinsey, which shows that you do actually achieve better outcomes with a diverse set of people in the room. And of course, it is the right thing to do. So moving on then to the next slide, I just wanted to present one case study, because I know there can be a sense that perhaps, you know, well, we've been talking about this for a long time, surely all these problems should be solved now. But I think what we can see is that when you look at studies that have been done quite recently, and you go to sets of figures such as the SHE figures, which are put together by the EU to look across the whole of the EU 28, you can see that actually change isn't happening terribly fast. So if you take a particular case study of the underrepresentation of women at senior levels in academia, you can see that looking from 2002 to 2013, there hasn't been a great shift in that data. They are still gathering data, and there will be an update to come this year from SHE, but you can see that there is actually still an issue in terms of encouraging people through the pipeline. And while this is research that's done in academia, and you could make an argument, well, perhaps in research infrastructures, we could benefit from people moving out of the academic research pipeline. You do also see this in business and in pretty much any environment that certain groups are underrepresented the further up the management and decision-making processes that you go. So there are various mechanisms that we can use to improve the situation. And one of these is an equal opportunities policy. So our recommendation from ELIXIR would be that each organisation within the infrastructure should have their own institutional equal opportunities policy. So standing separate from the ELIXIR one, which we will be developing and working with you on, your organisation itself should have its own policy. So the reason for this are it demonstrates your institution's commitment to equality and fairness, it raises staff awareness, it reduces workplace conflict by having procedures that people can follow if they are unhappy with the fairness of the way that they are being treated, for example. So from that point of view, it also boosts morale, increases staff retention, and by stating explicitly that you are an equal opportunities employer, it does then attract a more diverse pool of applicants into your organisation. Of course, protects from legal action against national law, and in some cases can even improve your path to funding. There are some agencies who are now requiring direct evidence of actions that you are taking in the areas of diversity. So increasingly, it's something which needs to be you need to pay serious attention to. So one of the questions that I would be asking you guys is, does your organisation actually have an equal opportunities policy, and can we link to that from our document, because we're very keen to provide examples of good practice in this area and to share that amongst the infrastructure. So then moving on to recruitment. So again, we have a recommendation that we've drafted here, which is to take a look at your recruitment processes, because recruitment is one of the key ways that you can, of course, increase diversity within the people in your organisation. So that's coming both from the aspect of the people who apply to your organisation and then those who work there and progress through it. So what we would recommend that you're looking at is making sure that from your available pool, that is then represented through each stage of the recruitment process. So, for example, if 20% of your applicants are female, then you would expect to see a similar percentage in your long list, your short list, and in your interviewing profile. And then when you look at your hires over a period of time, you should then also see that percentage coming through as well. It's quite useful to look at recruitment in batches, and then you can see if there's a particular grouping that is rather overrepresented in the people that you're hiring. That becomes a lot more obvious if you look at it as a batch. So the recommendation regarding the impact of unconscious bias is those unconscious biases that pretty much all of us carry as a result of having absorbed various stereotyping and assumptions over time. And in certain circumstances, say if we're making decisions rather quickly, those unconscious biases can come in. So it's about finding techniques and ways to make sure we don't have that opportunity to revert to our unconscious biases when we're making hiring decisions. And there's a great handbook that is provided by the Libra project, which is funded by the EC in the area of life sciences. And they have a series of recommendations in there for areas such as how you form your selection committee, making sure that you have diverse representation there, monitoring those percentages, as I said, as you go through the process, making sure that the job description is written in a way that doesn't actively put people off from particular groups, and making sure that your selection criteria are clearly defined before you advertise the position, so you're not trying to work on some idea of fit. There's some interesting research that says that if you have only one woman on the shortlist, her statistical chances of getting hired are almost zero, which is a very interesting piece of research. So I would encourage you to have a look at that, go and read it. But the idea would be then to encourage you to have perhaps more women on your shortlist so that you don't get that outlier effect creeping in. And of course, making your candidates feel welcome and ensuring equality between salaries and benefits across all employees of similar positions. And if you can, separating out those conversations on work-life balance versus actually assessing the person's suitability for the role. So you're making decisions on how good a fit they are to your criteria rather than whether they can work full-time, part-time, job sharing, and so on. So then just to say briefly about terms and conditions of employment, this is really where you are reflecting your equal opportunities policy. So the recommendation here would be to make sure that the principles that you've outlined in your equal opportunities policies, your intentions and wishes for the organisation, are actually upheld within the terms and conditions of employment. And there are a number of areas that you can look at when it comes to carers' leaves, patterns of working, how you deal with ad hoc absence from work, nursery childcare provision, and then how you look after people who are either perhaps coming back into the workplace or helping them to stay within the workplace, and making sure that your appraisal and development processes, as well as your disciplinary procedures, are fair as well. So again, in terms of feedback from you, we'd be looking for the options to link through to any existing documents that you have for terms and conditions of employment that we can put into our document. So then just to talk about committees and governance. So gender balance is a key area. So there are already strong recommendations from ELIXIR on this. So when considering new appointments to decision-making bodies, that the gender balance of that body should be taken into account. So particularly for ELIXIR boards which are appointed by ELIXIR, but also those that are appointed through national bodies. So you can see the decision-making bodies that we've listed out there. And just to note that there are a number of countries now who have actually legislated quotas for women on corporate boards for public listed companies, and the benchmark they tend to set is around 40% of the underrepresented gender. So if, for example, you were to have a look at our current membership of our decision-making bodies, you can see some are more balanced than others when it comes to gender. And if you were to apply the 40% criteria there, you can see which ones would already meet that, if that was a standard that you wanted to apply. And of course, you'll note that where you also have 100% female leadership, that wouldn't meet that 40%. So it really is about finding a balance. So then going on to talk about training and events. These are obviously areas where we have a lot of interaction with the community, and we want to ensure that we have a real diversity of participation in those events. And that would include the participants, but also those who are running and leading the events as well. So our recommendation would be to ensure that there is a diversity and a representative gender split, again, within those. So looking at areas such as the programme committee, putting the event together, who's chairing sessions, who's speaking, what's the profile of delegates that you are able to attract, and who's doing the training and who's receiving the training. So if you have other ideas for data that we could collect from our training and events, that would be very interesting to hear from you. How would you feel, for example, if you were to need to fill out an anonymous survey on other aspects of ethnicity or sexual orientation and things like that? is that data that we could also be collecting from our training and events, of course, always complying with GDPR with our data collection. So we took a quick look at some of the data from our ELIXIR events in 2017. So this isn't all the events, this is a sort of representative sample. So the ELIXIR All Hands meeting there, you can see, is the largest event that we hosted, or of this set that we've looked at. And what we would be looking for really is to see what percentage women are attending the event, and then is that then represented within the speakers, for example. So if you were to take the All Hands meeting, you can see that around 30% of the attendees were women. Well, arguably perhaps that could be more, but the number of speakers was of a similar percentage, so they're not underrepresented among the speakers. And in fact, there's slightly more in the programme committee and more again in chairs. And that's pretty much a pattern that you can see in the other events as well, perhaps with a slight exception there of the SME Data-Driven Innovation meeting, where you've actually got women are rather underrepresented in the speakers there. So moving on to communities and collaborations. So the document, the strategy that we are forming at the moment talks a little bit about accessibility of tools and services. So there are a lot of accessibility standards out there, particularly from the W3C if you're talking about tools with a web interface. So to make sure that they are actually meeting those accessibility standards, and there are websites you can use to test code and how it works with screen readers and things like that. We would also like to work with our communities in the use cases to make sure we have as diverse a participation in what we're doing as possible. So we've already talked about events and training. We have a strong staff exchange programme, which is another area we could look at in order to promote diversity. And of course, sharing our metrics and our data will be very important as well, so that we can benchmark amongst each other. We have great opportunities to collaborate with other research infrastructures through Corbel, and more widely with global communities through other collaborations. So, and one of the areas that we will be making recommendations in is grants. So ELIXIR would be recommending that all grants consider diversity in areas such as work package leadership. You could look at having co-leadership as development opportunities and make sure that equal opportunities are covered in all aspects of the grant. So that will be one of the recommendations that we would like to make. So then moving on to data. So it's difficult for us to know how well we are doing if we're not collecting data on the profile of people that we have within the infrastructure. And once we have that data, that enables us to establish a baseline, and then we can track trends year on year to see how and if things are actually changing as a result of some of the activities that we're taking. So that would be looking at, as I say, the staffing profile within the organisation, looking at recruitment data to see whether the pool is actually being represented in that process. And what we would like to do is to have a section in the annual report and publish that on the website as well, and perhaps go out to some events and so on and report back on that as well. So one area it would be useful to have some input from is on the models that we have thought about adopting as regards the nodes when it comes to taking an approach to data. So I work with the IRA Forum laboratories, and some, for example, are very well developed in the data that they gather because they need to do it for national legislation. For others who aren't actually subject to national legislation, it's a bit more of a new area, and it's quite difficult for them to gather some areas of data because the systems really aren't set up to do it. So it will be very interesting to know from the nodes, you know, where you fit in that profile. There's the idea of a mature node where, you know, data is embedded in everything that you're doing. It automatically informs policy, and it's quite easy then to track the impact of any actions that you take. Another model would be for developing, where you're moving towards that approach, but it's more on an individual project basis. So you gather data on a particular policy that you've changed rather than embedding that throughout. And then, of course, if you're still setting up those processes to gather data, you recognise that you need to gather it and it's useful to you, but you're not in a position yet to do that. So it will be useful to know for us what data you already collect, if there's any that you must collect as a result of national legislation. So, for example, in the UK, we now must publish gender pay gap data if a company is larger than, has more than 250 employees. It's fairly broad brush, but it's required. So there may be other schemes like that. And also whether you're doing any benchmarking against national schemes as well. I've already mentioned Athena Swan in the UK. I know there are other charter schemes out there. So again, it'd be useful to know which ones are useful to you. So the recommendations that we're looking at here are, as I say, collecting the diversity data on applicants and staff annually and then reporting that back. We also, of course, need to make sure that all our data collection and processing is compliant with GDPR, and there's another webinar on that. And you can also consider benchmarking your diversity activities within national charter schemes, because it can be very useful. And in some cases, if you can get a badge to say that you've gone through that process and you've demonstrated good practice, then sometimes that can be linked to funding, as I've said. So the sort of data that we would be looking at collecting would be the gender split in your staffing at all levels, the gender split in areas such as promotions, who's working part-time, who's working full-time, what about fixed term versus permanent contracts, what the take-up of maternity, paternity, but also then other carer-related leaves, who's accessing training, what training is available, if you have child sick leave, is that taken up, and then what's the profile of people that are leaving the organisation as well. Do you have a particular age group that's leaving, which then ties into the last point about the average age of staff, which might sound a bit intrusive, but it's about looking at, are you losing people from that really important time when their career really starts to take off, and are you disproportionately losing particular groupings of people at around that sort of time. So then moving on to the Equal Opportunities Toolkit, we'd like to develop this probably through the intranet. We're following a model put together by the Genera project, which is actually for physics organisations, and what they've done is to bring together 100 or more different measures in the area of diversity, all the way from sort of outreach to schools, to career breaks, to policy, to large events, and to share some of those ideas and best practice to help kickstart things in your own organisation. So the sorts of areas that we could look at would be the exchange programme, if there are fellowships that could be put in place. We might want to think about a diversity strand at our all-hands meetings, networking lunches, take a look at career break returnships programmes, coaching and mentoring, outreach to educational organisations and the local community, and that's targeted at really widening the pool of applicants, because if you look in areas such as computational sciences, physical sciences, really is the pool is not particularly diverse. So in order to widen the number of applicants into your organisation, you need perhaps to be looking a bit further downstream. And we'd like to bring all those resources and links together on the intranet. So if you have any ideas for what you'd like to see in that toolkit, or indeed things, other toolkits that would be useful for us to link to, it'd be great to know about that. So then really the final part is to look at moving towards an equal opportunities policy. So we really believe that we can achieve a huge amount through raising awareness, through events such as such as this, by sharing our best practice and providing support with monitoring data and tracking outcomes. And we've sort of starting to condense that into the Equal Opportunity Strategy. So this is a document that's for reference and for guidance and to outline recommendations. What we need to do to look at as well is an Equal Opportunity Policy, which is more binding in terms of its recommendations. So that would then form part of the Handbook of Operations. And because that has binding elements in it, there is, of course, a consultation and ratification process that needs to be gone through. So that would be through consultation with you guys, as we're doing, and with the communities, and then working with the board to actually approve and ratify that. So the last thing I've included on the slides is a summary of the recommendations that we've drafted at the moment. These are elsewhere in the slides, but I've brought them together in one place at the end. So there is 14 of those at the moment. So I won't go through them again in detail. But we're very much looking for feedback on those. And as you can see, the questions are here at the end, and just to summarise the ones that I mentioned as we were going through, it was questions about your equal opportunities policies that you have in your own organisations. Does everyone have one of those? Can we link to it? What documents do you have relating to terms and conditions that we can share? What data do you think it would be helpful to share around training and events? And then when we're looking at staffing and recruitment, the sorts of data that you already collect and whether that ties in with what we're recommending, it would be useful to collect. And if there's anything that you have to collect and how you're benchmarking that. And finally, the toolkit, any ideas for useful items you would like to see in there, and of course, any other questions that you have. Thank you.